cousin Nate is in the Coast Guard, and he has been for over a decade. He's not the kind of guy to lie or make things up. He's one of the most straightforward people I know. Real grounded and not superstitious, not into horror, just a practical guy who likes boats and order. He told me this story in the summer of 2022. I asked him to repeat it more than once because of how messed up it was, and every time, the details stayed the same. This happened back in 2017, when he was assigned to a lighthouse off the coast of Maine on a 2-week maintenance rotation. The place was called Matinicus Rock, and it's way out there. You can only get to it by boat or helicopter. It's nothing more than a jagged, rocky island with a single lighthouse and one auxiliary building that stores fuel and maintenance equipment. There's no power grid, no plumbing, and barely any cell signal. The lighthouse itself is automated, but it still requires occasional manual upkeep, which is why the Coast Guard sends people out to it every year or so. Usually it's a solo assignment, but there had been strange electrical failures the year before, so for this trip they decided to send 2 people, Nate and another guy named Russell. The first few days were fine, windy, boring, and repetitive. During the day, they'd check the beacon mechanics, test the emergency batteries, refill the diesel generator, and scrape off layers of salt corrosion from the metal interior. At night, they'd read, eat simple meals, and kill time playing cards. It was isolation, but it was expected. No red flags. Then, on the 4th night, Nate woke up around 2 in the morning feeling weird. Not sick, not in pain, just like something was wrong with the atmosphere. The air was heavier than usual, and he said it felt like standing in a room right before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear and silent outside. He sat up and looked around. It was dark, and then he noticed something. There was no rotation from the beacon. The lighthouse was supposed to send out a sweeping light beam every few seconds, even during maintenance. It was a huge deal if the light failed. He got up and shook Russell awake, and the 2 of them made their way up the narrow spiral staircase to the top of the tower to see what was going on. When they got up there, they found the gears that rotated the beacon were still moving, but the actual light itself wasn't turning. Something was jammed in the mechanism. It was a large, dark piece of cloth, like a blanket or an old coat wedged deep into the gear assembly. The thing was soaked, covered in a slimy, mossy substance, and it smelled like rotting seaweed and mildew. They were both confused. The door had been locked, and the windows were sealed. No wind or birds. It didn't make sense. So they removed the fabric, tossed it outside into the wind, and went back to bed, thinking it was just some bizarre one-off incident. The next night, the exact same thing happened again. Around the same time, just after 2, Nate woke up and saw that the beacon wasn't turning. They went up and found another piece of cloth jammed into the same mechanism. Only this time, it wasn't the same type of fabric. It was smaller. Looked like an old-fashioned scarf or a shawl. It was red, frayed at the edges, and soaked through with what looked like ocean water. It even had tiny crustaceans clinging to it, like it had just come out of the sea. Nate said that was the moment things stopped feeling coincidental. They checked the doors, the windows, the supply closet, but everything was secure. Now they were starting to wonder if someone was messing with them, or worse, if something had gotten into the lighthouse and was deliberately trying to screw with the light. From that night on, they began blocking the stairwell with heavy crates after doing the final check upstairs. They locked the beacon room and the bottom entrance religiously, but on the 7th night, something happened that Nate still refuses to try to explain. He said he was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when he heard Russell whispering from across the room. But he wasn't talking to Nate. He was murmuring to the corner of the room, saying strange, disconnected things, like someone was standing there. Nate leaned up and asked what he was saying, and Russell blinked slowly and looked confused. He told Nate he wasn't saying anything. But later that night, Nate woke again and found Russell sitting at the window, staring down at the rocks below. When he asked what he was doing, Russell said he thought he saw someone standing down there on the rocks the night before, barely visible in the edge of the beacon light. He said it looked like someone was watching them, and then disappeared when the light rotated back. After that, things started spiraling. Russell got weirder every day. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking much, and just stared out the window for hours. Nate asked him if he was okay, and Russell would just mutter about noises in the wall or about hearing voices from inside the stairwell. On the 9th night, they both heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the usual creaking from the wind, but real, slow, deliberate footsteps, one after the other, coming down from the beacon room above. Nate looked over and saw Russell standing at the bottom of the stairs, frozen and staring up. He asked him if he'd gone up there, and Russell just looked at him and said no. Then he asked if Nate had. Neither of them had moved. They stood there listening, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. That night, they shoved a dresser in front of the bedroom door and slept with knives under their pillows. On the 11th night, they were woken up again by the beacon failing. This time, when they reached the top of the lighthouse, the beacon room door was wide open. Not just unlocked, not just cracked open, completely swung open like someone had kicked it in. The wind was howling through, and when they got inside, the beacon wasn't just stopped. It had been deliberately tampered with. The bulb was unscrewed and placed upright in the middle of the room. That thing is industrial grade. You can't just twist it off by hand without effort. Nate stared at it, terrified, while Russell just kept muttering that someone had done it. Then, Nate felt something brush against his back. Something cold. He spun around, but no one was there. Russell had gone pale. He just kept pointing at the wall, whispering that he saw a hand come out of the bricks. They ran back down the stairs and locked themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell started rocking back and forth in the corner, whispering to someone who wasn't there. The next morning, Nate used the emergency sat phone and called for an early pickup, saying there had been a serious mechanical failure. The boat showed up that afternoon, but here's the creepiest part. When they arrived, the crew asked them about the distress call they had made at 2:12 a.m. that morning, but Nate had never made any call. He didn't touch the phone until daylight. The deckhand said they'd received a garbled call that came through with static and a voice saying something about someone being there with them. Then it cut out. Russell didn't speak the entire ride back. He quit the Coast Guard a few months later and never told anyone what really happened out there. Nate still does maintenance duty sometimes, but he says he'll never ever go back to Matinicus Rock. This happened during COVID lockdowns. It was around the point of it where everyone was really getting sick of it and going stir-crazy cooped up in their houses with nothing to do. I was single at the time and was swiping on Tinder and just DMing people while watching movies and shows because really what else was there to do on a weeknight during lockdown? I struck up a conversation with some girl I'd been following on Instagram for years. Her name was Sophia. She goes by Soph. We live in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, about 20 minutes to half an hour from the Hamptons and like an hour from Montauk. We were bored one night and agreed to hang out. She lives like 5 minutes from me conveniently, so I picked her up. We went for a drive to a nearby park that was closed, and we just drank White Claws there. I immediately got the vibe she was a little rebellious, but like in a cool way. She was down to hop fences and trespass and do things like that. There was a mutual connection very quickly, and within less than an hour, she came up with the idea of driving out to Montauk and walking the cliff walk around the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds were closed past sunset. I think they may have been closed in general during lockdown, not 100% sure on that. But right away, I said I was down. I like adventures like that. So we finished our drinks and drove all the way out east to Montauk Point. When we got there, she told me to just park in the lighthouse parking lot. I was a bit hesitant about this, but she seemed pretty confident that there would be no security on a random Tuesday night during lockdown in the off-season. I mean, I didn't see any cars in sight, so I took her word for it. She said she'd done this before, even before COVID. We parked and had another White Claw in the parking lot. I would nervously look around from time to time, making sure no security vehicles were scoping the place out, and she would tell me to relax. We eventually started walking over to the lighthouse. Seeing a lighthouse at night so closely and just staring up at it, it's so cool, but it's also a bit eerie. Can't explain it, but there's something kind of liminal about it. Soph led the way. I guess it was a bit out of the way of the actual entrance, just so we wouldn't be walking directly into the light and potentially exposing ourselves. This was my first time ever at the Montauk Lighthouse. She led us straight to the cliffside behind the lighthouse that had a bunch of rocks forming a trail of sorts called the Cliff Walk. We were navigating solely with our flashlights. Maybe there were supposed to be lights on down there, but that night, mostly everything was off besides a few lights by the front entrance and of course the lighthouse light itself. As we started making our way around the cliff walk, being mindful of our steps, eventually, Soph, who was walking behind me now, said my name. I turned to her, and she was pointing her light behind her, exposing someone behind us also on the rocks. With both of us shining our lights over, it was easier to make him out. He was wearing a coat with a hood over his head. He looked like he was a black guy, but we couldn't tell how old or anything else about him. I called over asking if he worked here, and he didn't answer, but he also wasn't moving either. I followed it up with, "We're gonna leave, sorry." I was mostly nervous that it was a security worker or something and that we were gonna get in trouble, but then the guy said something to us. He said, "Y'all wanna buy some coke?" Finding out that wasn't a security guard, but simply a random guy was not a relief at all. If anything, it was more nerve-wracking, because why the hell was this creepy guy following us? Why was he even here? I said, "No man, we're good," and motioned for Soph to keep moving. I let her go in front of me, and we pressed forward. As we walked along, the guy started moving too. He didn't follow up with anything, like, "You sure?" He remained silent, but he seemed to move at the same pace as us. Soph or I would glance back with our lights every so often, and he'd be the same distance away. It was the strangest, most uncomfortable thing. It made the rest of the experience tense as could be. We made it to the end of the cliff walk, and hurried through the grass back to the car. That guy from before was still following, basically matching our speed. We heard him call something over to us. It sounded like, "Where are you going?" This guy was obviously looking for trouble. I didn't want to instigate anything, so I didn't respond, and I told Soph not to as well. We walked side by side quickly to the car, and that's when we noticed two more guys walking over from behind us as well. I didn't want to run because that would definitely lead to them chasing us, but one of the other guys called something over to us as well. I didn't hear what it was. We got to the car and hurried inside, and Soph and I screamed when we both realized the three guys were right on top of the car now. I locked the car immediately, I swear, only seconds before two of them tried opening different doors. I put the car in reverse, basically the only direction where I wouldn't be hitting any of them with the car. They kicked and hit my car as I reversed out, but they didn't bother chasing us once we were in motion. On the ride back, I know that both of our hearts were racing, and after the adrenaline wore off, we were both quiet. We called it a night after I dropped her off. We ended up hanging out many times after that, and we're still in touch today. But honestly, that night still unsettles me. It was too close for comfort to something bad happening. My friends think it was a gang, Crips maybe. Whatever it was, I have no interest going back out there at night. My name is Gregory. This was a story my old friend Ian has told me many times that happened to him many moons ago. I asked him to give me a detailed version in writing recently that he gave me permission to share online because I always found it so unsettling. Ian was one of those guys you only had to meet once to know he was the real deal. 50-something, solid build, weathered skin from decades working in salt air. He worked in marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. Basically, when something broke near the water, Ian was one of the people you'd call to go fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship technician, even spent time doing remote inspections for the government. The guy had seen just about everything, so when he told me this story, I didn't doubt it. Not for a second. He said it happened back in 2013, when he got hired by a small county up in Washington state to do a structural inspection of an old decommissioned lighthouse. The county had inherited the property years earlier and didn't know what to do with it. Developers wanted to tear it down, historians wanted to preserve it, and no one wanted to pay for it either. So Ian's job was simple: go there alone, assess the place inside and out, and figure out whether it was even safe to restore. The lighthouse was on a remote rock island about an hour off the mainland. Not a big island either, just a hunk of stone and dirt maybe 300 feet wide, with nothing but the lighthouse itself, a generator shed, and some rusted out old scaffolding from decades past. The place hadn't been used in years, and it wasn't exactly a tourist destination. There weren't even any docks, just a little ledge where a small Coast Guard boat could offload someone at high tide. Ian packed light, food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, some tools, a clipboard, and a two-way marine radio. The plan was simple. He'd get dropped off Monday morning, do a full walkthrough by Wednesday, and call in for pickup Thursday afternoon. He didn't think twice about going alone. He'd done this sort of thing dozens of times before. When he first got there, the place was quiet, cold, cloudy, but calm. The air had that usual mix of salt, metal, and decay you expect from something that's been sitting abandoned for decades. The lighthouse itself was tall, maybe 50 feet, built in the early 1900s. It had the classic spiral staircase inside, which led up to the beacon room. That glass lens hadn't worked in decades, but the structure itself was solid. Ian did his usual safety checks: support beams, stair integrity, window fittings. The floorboards on the lower level were warped but walkable. The second floor was a storage room, which was empty except for some rusted metal cabinets. The third floor had a tiny sleeping quarter that hadn't been used in decades. He ended up laying out his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room where it was warmer and out of the wind. The first night was uneventful. It was quiet, like too quiet, Ian said. You don't notice how noisy the world usually is until it's not. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of waves slapping against the rocks outside. Just wind, and even that was soft. On the second day, the fog rolled in thick. Ian woke up to a completely white world outside. You couldn't see more than 5 feet beyond the window. He said it wasn't like any fog he'd seen before. It was so dense it looked solid, like a wall, but he didn't think much of it. That area got heavy fog often. He spent most of the day taking notes on the upper stairwell. That's when he noticed the first weird thing. Halfway up the staircase to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He'd tried to open it on day 1, but the hinges were so corroded it wouldn't budge. But now, it was open a crack. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough that you could tell it had been moved. He figured the moisture in the air had caused it to shift, but he didn't like it. The inside of the closet was pitch black, and when he pushed the door wider, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A wooden box, maybe the size of a lunchbox, and it was covered in a kind of damp moss, like it had been underwater recently. He didn't open it. He just shut the door again and made a note to report it. That night, something woke him up. He said it wasn't a sound exactly, but more so the absence of sound, like everything had stopped. And then, he heard footsteps on the metal stairs above him. At first he thought an animal got inside, but then he realized they weren't descending. The steps were going upward. Whatever was in the tower was climbing. He turned on his flashlight and stared at the stairwell entrance, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually the sound stopped and the silence returned. The next day, he searched the whole place, top to bottom. He checked every room and every closet. He even climbed onto the roof, but there was nothing. No animals or anything out of the ordinary, except that box. It was now sitting outside the closet, halfway into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He said he stood there for a long time staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The wood was bloated with moisture, but the lid didn't open. It was nailed shut. He didn't want to mess with it too much, so he left it at the base of the stairs and went outside for air. That's when he noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. Bare footprints. Not boots or shoes, but bare wet feet, leading from the north side of the building toward the cliff edge and then stopping. The footprints didn't circle back. They were just 10 or 12 barefoot impressions in the mud that ended at a sheer drop into the sea. He said he stood there for a long time trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come ashore, but the only boat scheduled was his return ride, and that wasn't for another day. He considered using the radio to call for an early pickup, but the fog was so thick that by then, they probably wouldn't even be able to navigate back. He went inside and locked every door and hatch, and then he wedged the stairwell shut with an iron pipe, and he tried to sleep. That night was worse. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door to the upper beacon room slam shut violently. He said the force shook dust loose from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside wall of the tower. Not the front door or window, but the wall itself. Like someone standing just inches behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles against the brick. Ian didn't move. He lay there frozen until the sound stopped. When the sun came up, he checked everything again. The box was gone, and the closet door was fully open. At this point, it was abundantly clear he wasn't alone there, so Ian used the radio and called for immediate extraction. The fog was still heavy, but he told them it was a medical issue. They said they'd try to get a boat there within a few hours. He packed everything and waited by the landing ledge. The fog didn't clear. In fact, it apparently got thicker. He sat there for nearly 7 hours, unable to see anything more than a few feet in front of him. The sun was going down, and the air had gotten cold. He heard someone walking behind him in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse, but when he turned around, there was no one there, or he simply just couldn't see who it was through the fog. He ran to the edge of the cliff and stayed there until he heard the boat horn in the distance. They pulled him out just after dark. The deckhand who helped him on board asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian told him that the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. He filed a brief report back at the office. He said the structure was compromised and not fit for entry, but he never mentioned the footsteps or the box. He told me he didn't because he genuinely considered the possibility that he simply was losing his mind in isolation. This was around the end of what Ian sent me in writing. Ian never went back to that lighthouse. He wrapped up his remaining projects that year and quietly phased himself out of field work. Within a year, he stopped taking contracts altogether, said he wanted to focus on dry land from then on. When I asked if it was because of the lighthouse, he just shrugged and said he'd seen enough out there. I pressed him once, just once, about what he really thought happened on that island. He looked me dead in the eye and said something that kind of stuck with me ever since. He said, "Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence." That was all he'd say. I tried to look into the lighthouse myself a while back, but I couldn't find much. The coordinates he'd scribbled in his notes don't point to any listed structure. The county records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there's no official name and no accessible history. It's like it was never really there in the first place. And that's the part that unsettles me most. Not what Ian said, but what nobody else ever did. I don't honestly know whether I hope Ian really was just for whatever reason going crazy on that island or not.